thank you for joining us. And good morning, Alex, Dimitrij. Obviously, we've known each other for a few years, but it'd be great if you could just give yourselves a quick intro, what you do, and then we'll get into things.
Sure. Thanks very much for having us. I'm Alex Galbraith. I'm the CTO for our cloud services unit at SoftwareOne. I've been in IT for 20 plus years, hence the salt and pepper beard. And I've predominantly been working in the cloud and architecture space for about the last 10, 12 years.
Okay. Hi, I'm Dimitrij Zub. I lead the application services, data and AI business at SoftwareOne. Been at SoftwareOne for about 1.5 years now, and before that, many years in different IT companies, AWS, Intel, Alcatel-Lucent. So yeah, happy to be here. Thanks for inviting us.
And thank you for joining us. Obviously today we're going to talk about some of the data and AI observations you've got. It's a very interesting time at the moment. Things are developing very quickly. I mean, let's kick off straight away. What are you seeing at the moment? What projects are you working on that you think are really interesting in demonstrating that momentum we're seeing in the market?
As I'm responsible for the global business, I think it's very diverse across where you look at. So if you look at Europe, a lot of the organization we work with are focusing on helping their employees, helping their customers interact better with them. So we see projects in the customer experience sector, in the customer support area, but also in employee productivity area. But on the other sides, when we look at Latin America, where we see way more on big data project and data cleansing project and working on much broader public safety challenges. I think, Alex, you have a great case study for that. When we look into the Eastern Europe, and we also work with Ukrainian organization, for example, where they focusing very hard to increase operational efficiency because, of course, they have a human resource challenge, they have an operational challenge. In Asia, there's a lot of innovative potential. So Asia is one of the regions that's growing very rapidly and very open to experimenting with crazy new things, from specific document processing to generation of unique content for in the luxury sector. So we had an interesting proof of concept done recently in Dubai, where a customer is looking to generate outbound email based on the yacht you rented, which hotels you should be renting next. So a lot of experiments, focus on people, focus on operational efficiency, but also a lot of foundational works depending where you are in the world.
I think there's a really interesting kind of case there that a lot of organizations these days are starting their journey in AI because they've been triggered by this amazing thing that they've heard about called generative AI. But the reality of it is probably half of the use cases you just described, they're actually using traditional machine learning techniques and so forth that have been around for a long time. You go all the way back to the 80s when cognitive neural networks started. So it's not a new technology, but we've seen the adoption of that technology then suddenly leapfrog over the last few years, in part driven by this whole generative AI wave.
I think it's an interesting point. So we have kind of an internal term we call generative AI. Is the hot kid on the block. Every keynote has so much generative AI in it that you start scratching out bingo cards. But we come back a lot into what we call boring AI. NLP, computer vision, it becomes so much cheaper to operate on this one for specific use cases. So yes, customers are triggered right now still to look at generative AI or at AI again. And in a lot of cases, we come back and say, listen, it's a great way to apply AI, but it's a nice use case where we have the right technology to help you out.
So I think what you're saying really is it's not a one size fits all, and it's the right tool for the right use case. And certainly sounds like some of the customers you're working with are already seeing great value from it. It's always very easy to talk about the great successes, and we all like to do so. But what are you seeing at the moment where people are less successful in trying to adopt the technology? What are the pitfalls that our users need to try and avoid if they want to be successful in their AI projects?
There's a really interesting stat. I think HBR published it like a year or two ago. They said 80% of all AI projects fail, or they're estimated 80% of all AI projects fail. And I think it was just over half, this was from a different study, just over half of all AI projects don't necessarily deliver what they were expecting to up front. And the big pattern there, I think, is organizations not having a vision and an understanding of what it was they thought they were going to get from AI in the first place. This is something I think you talk regularly with customers about, isn't it?
Yeah, if I think what I want to touch on one point here, Alex. So I see right now a lot of organizations trying to kind of force transform themselves. We see this AI-powered organization or AI-first organization, and there's a lot of momentum that is created as perspective from the leadership, but at the end it creates a lot of noise. Actually, when I go and talk about this, I ask one question: how many of you have to do AI because your executive asked you to do it? And majority of the engineers and middle management raise their hands, and ask you, and how many of you know what the leadership wants you to do with this? And almost nobody raises their hand. And this comes back to, if you really want to use AI to transform as an organization, you need to put in the legwork to actually understand what AI is capable from in the boardroom, in the C-level. And you need to create a vision how AI is helping the organization get better. And what I mean is not like we want to fill out spreadsheets faster by applying technology X, but how is this becoming a new pillar of my organizational success? As we didn't have software engineering in the 60s. And then in the 70s, this whole idea, computers came up, and then we have a whole new organization suddenly, which is software engineering and software development. And people needed to figure out what to do with this. And I think in a similar paradigm shift, you now have this new technology called AI and generative AI, which has become scaled to consumers. So what do you do with this? You either embrace it as one organizational pillar, you give it a purpose and a vision, and you make sure that everybody in the organization understands it. Now, organizations that don't do this end up with basement experiments. And basement experiments right now can be very costly, or they can just burn resources that you could have used somewhere else in improving a process, which is currently run on pen and paper.
Okay, so I mean, you started to touch on it there. Let's talk a little bit about, if an organization wants to be successful, what approaches would you recommend, and how should they go about setting themselves up for success in adopting AI and generative AI?
I think there's three key pillars. We see a lot of strategy right now. So let me first mention the three key pillars: vision, strategies, and then clear milestones and goals. So we see a lot of strategy. We want to use AI in this specific thing, or we want to have a center of innovation, but they all lack a coherent vision. Why are you doing this? Why are you bringing this together? How do you communicate this with the employees? So I think, first of all, start with why and figure, why do you even want to apply AI in what kind of organization? I think I mentioned a very simple example in one of my talks where I say, one of such visions could be, we apply AI to empower each and single employee to make better decisions. That's a very simple vision, but it immediately helps to do pressure testing and says, is it really helping employees? Is it a better decision? Is it a faster decision? You can now have conversation where each and single department can align themselves. Am I using AI for the sake of using AI, or am I still aligned with this?
Then, on that front, and I'm sure you won't mind me sharing this at a recent talk, Dimitrij said, FOMO is not a strategy. And I think that summarizes that entire point really, really accurately. And the point there around those users, there has to be a reason not only for the business to want to do the thing, but there has to be a reason for the users to want to adopt users to want to adopt that. That could be users inside of your organization because you're building some kind of AI tool internally to improve their work life, or it could be something that your customers are looking to adopt. A perfect example, I forget the chap's name, but he says culture eats strategy for breakfast, right? So you can have this amazing strategy, but if your end users of this platform are not interested, you're not going to get the adoption, you're not going to get the value. In the UK, we had this concept of something called smart metering. And for the past 10 years, the government has been trying to encourage everybody to adopt smart meters, but actually they're nowhere near the targets that they wanted to get to because end users have not yet seen what is the value. They haven't communicated that effectively, and so culturally they haven't adopted that idea. So I think that culture piece is absolutely critical to ensuring that you're going to get adoption. And
I actually, a great example here, Alex. If you have no vision, don't expect people to fall and align with your strategy. The first thing you sell is a story, is why we are doing this as a company, where are we getting to. This is why vision is so critical. And majority of these organizational transformation fail And they failed already 10 years ago when it was about big data, and data is the new oil. And we still deal with the same Excel-powered companies because there was no real vision why data matters and why we should be a data-driven organization.
So democratizing data, sounds like the end game for a lot of people, but it's about how you bring, whether that be your internal employee base, whether that be your external customers, whether that's a combination of both, how do you bring those people along with you? How do you make them understand the reason you're democratizing data for them? So what advice do you have for people in terms of how do you bring your workforce along with you? How do you empower your employees to take advantage of the tooling that's available?
This is a broad question because bring along is a complex matter. So on one side, you have to educate them what that means. What does democratic data access mean? And I want to touch on a failure story here. We typically see organizations fail in data democratization because they don't take their employees who have to interact democratically with the data also into their shared responsibility of managing data responsibly. So what do we see right now? And this leads to data being condensed into a silo, into a typical business intelligence engineering and data platform teams, where we have to control who has access to this data. We have to manage this. And then the data gets democratized by Jane Smith downloading a spreadsheet out of the Power BI report and sending it by email to Janet. This is still happening, and it's happening even worse. So if you want to democratize data, you need to also implement shared responsibility and educational system so that every employee interacting with data is empowered, feels safe on accessing this data, sharing this data, and understanding this data. This is truly where you start breaking out the silos. So I think it's fundamentally important to create this shared responsibility model for data management and not try to say we democratize data by giving everybody a Power BI dashboard or a QuickSight dashboard. So that's one key pillar.
As they always say, 9 times out of 10, it's a people and process problem. It's not a technology problem.
Yeah.
Interestingly, the other, if you take the technology angle on that, you were talking there about creating this central, this repository, the central silo for your data. Great. It's all very well having that central silo, but then how do you know what's in there? How do you make it searchable? How do you make it governed in a way that prevents some of that data leaking to individuals in the organization that shouldn't have access? You don't want your entire payroll being leaked to anybody in the organization, but that might also sit in a central data repository that your EB needs access to be able to run reports and get information about how do they run the business. So getting that into a central repository is just step one, categorizing it, managing it, and then making it securely available to users based on the roles that they have and the access that they need is also incredibly important.
And I think step 0, because you said getting it in there is step 1. Step 0 is caring about getting that data into that repository itself. Yeah. Because what we also see is, again, we talk about democratizing data access. And as you said, even if we categorize and share, some departments just don't share this data. They don't see a reason for their information to be flow in, so they become consumers. And I want to come back to this vision and culture thing, because you need to create an organizational setup and goals where departments want to interact with data, not only as consumers. That's what they're used to, downloading reports, but also to upload it, to categorize it and share it, implement the proper measurements and KPIs, so you have this incentive. This is where you truly create a data lake of company-wide information and where people can start becoming creative with it.
So let's try and get a little bit specific then. How would you advise an organization, and feel free to use a specific example if you've got one, to build the business case for a successful data and generative AI project? We've talked about let's make sure we've got a purpose first rather than starting with technology. But once we've got that purpose, we've got that vision, how do we build that business case, that ROI around the potential workload?
Let's assume we have a vision. And now we are at the stage to developing a strategy, and it should be a profitable strategy. So if you think about a business case, I like to think about explicit monetization. How much dollar do I get out for a dollar spent? And implicit monetization, are we evolving as a company by doing so? So I think look right now into the things that do not work. Don't adopt what everybody else is doing. Look at your organization, look at the process that is making people insufferable, ask them and start fixing that. It's the easiest one to assess. One of the organizations I work with had a process where it takes multiple data sources, just a very simple back of a napkin calculation, even multiple data sources. One person is downloading them a spreadsheet, spends a whole week copy pasting data between spreadsheets, then creates another spreadsheet that goes through a third-party approval process to generate another spreadsheet to then create the specific cost traits for their business. Sounds absolutely cumbersome. Now, if you think about the downstream impact of this process, because it's so cumbersome, they can only do it once every 3 months, which means they can update the cost rates once every 3 months. And this costs this business millions of dollars. Now, instead of going arcane about this, and not the Netflix show, but just super smart and thinking about something awesome, fix this one thing. Learn how to apply technology. Get this one business process done in a way that you can do this repeatably, consistently, every week based on the data quality, and you would have an immediate ROI. The second thing, if your company right now doesn't have a failure culture, you are burning money. You are not innovating. You are trying to save money all over the place. This is a new technology. You don't know what you don't know. So go to the other side of the spectrum. Create a budget for random experimentation, things what people get excited about, because you need this emotional aspect to align your people behind your vision. You need people to say, have you seen this? Have you tried that? This is pretty awesome. It saved me 15 hours of work. Or I had this great idea because I'm consistently looking at my daily business, and if we had that, it would save me 2 hours out of every day. You want people to talk this way. And you want them to be passionate and share. And in order to do that, you need to have sandboxes and playgrounds. So those are two very distinct monetization. One is fix what's broken, and AI is a great tool to do that. And the other one, figure out what you don't know by inciting and igniting passion within your workforce to experiment and play and do cool new things so that they see AI as an ally and not as a risk.
That's actually a really interesting point. The risk element. So many organizations, I think today, one of the blockers to adoption is trust. They don't know if they can trust the technology. They don't know if they can trust the way that they implement. More than half of organizations have said in recent surveys from, I think BCG did one, that they don't have the skills to confidently adopt these technologies. And so the first step, almost the step zero of that one, is the building of the trust, right? So you gave a perfect example, Dimitrij, with pick a solution to a painful problem. Ideally, a small solution, something that's you can deliver quite quickly, you can iterate on, you can fail a couple of times in working out how this thing works. But once you've got that first thing in place, you go from a position of people not understanding this technology, being scared of this technology, to, oh, this has solved my problem. Now I can start to see, if I can solve that using this technology, how can I solve this next problem, this next problem? And you flip it around from a situation where you're trying to convince the business that this is something that's going to actually be of a benefit, to the business coming back to you, users coming back to you and going, I've got this use case and this use case and this use case. And so your demand then is skyrocketing. So far better to be in that reverse demand cycle, if you put it that way. But you won't get there if you don't build that trust first. And that again goes back to people, culture, etc. Getting that buy-in from the rest of the business at every level, not just at an executive level, but frontline users in the business.
So yeah, I mean, I've seen this for many years in technology, that the businesses that are very successful adopt a fail-fast approach, a culture where it is acceptable to experiment and be successful or unsuccessful. And sometimes those failures can lead to future successes through great learnings. I guess the question is, how do we manage risk when we're encouraging experimentation? Because there's always a trade-off and there's a balance here.
So I think it's a really interesting question. I think it starts with a question of scope. So anytime you talk about fail fast, you can fail fast and you can fail big, or you can fail fast, you can fail small. And so starting with projects where you can build that scar tissue, that confidence, however you want to put it, and failing on internal things that are not going to be public facing, things that are not going to directly affect, say, your customer base or whatever for your organization. That's where you want to kind of begin that journey, especially in that trust building phase. After that, your likelihood of failure then reduces over time because you're building that experience.
One point with failure, yes. So I've seen organizations that have this failure culture, but I think it's being confused for do random things and see if they work. You're laughing, but it's actually a lot of the truth. So we have this, sorry, I'm from Germany, but we have this German engineering culture, don't do it unless you know it's going to work. And then we have the opposite of it, do random things and see if they work. What I encourage organization to do, because at the end of the day, it has to have some kind of, it costs money or it has to generate financial benefit, is do the legwork of measuring what you're trying to do. And so if you can fail fast, you can even fail expensively, but it's not as expensive if you really understood what made the failure happen. When do you pull the end on cord? What are the learning out of this failure? So failure culture is not about making failures cheap or allowing failures to happen. It is an equal amount of making sure that people understand that we have to learn from these failures, writing, correction of error reports, and bringing this into continuous evolution in the organization, especially now with AI. We are in a net new technology. We've seen absolute disasters happening in the field. We know the Chevrolet story. We see McDonald's pull out their AI project from the order kiosk. We had the Air Canada, where they have been basically sued to comply with the policy made up by generative AI. And this means, on one hand, this was a big failure. But we know so little right now from these companies. How should we learn from it? And we see way more just restriction happening on. So I think you can go and do this and experiment and learn from these companies, learn from your peers and partners as well on what not to do.
And that actually, you make a really interesting point there around, I think some of these organizations arguably overestimated what they could achieve with AI straight off the bat.
Well, it's hype.
Exactly. And so that concept of not overestimating the capabilities straight away and working out, okay, what can we do on that small iterative step basis instead of trying to jump to this wild imaginative thing? Just start small, grow from there. And I think that's going to reduce that risk, that's going to reduce the failure rate, but it's okay if you then fail.
One of the things I would touch on, so you talked about random experimentation. Whilst you caution people against experimenting in every direction, what I would say though is innovation can come from random places. So I would encourage organizations, and I've seen very successful organizations who create the platform for innovation at every level and every part of their business.
And I absolutely agree with this. I agree with this. What I want to highlight here is, yes, go out, give people budget, give them AWS accounts and credits to go and play and try new technology. Allow them to fail, and wondering is an essential process, right? Without wondering, you will never come up with new ideas. All good. But do the legwork to measure why you failed. Do the legwork to understand what was the process made, what was the takeaway. Amazon has this great story here, right? Without the Fire Phone, there would not be an Alexa, because it was a multi-billion failure, according to Jeff Bezos in one of his letters to the shareholders. But they learned from it. They understood what means to bring new consumer technology to the market, what worked best and what didn't, and what to push forward. And I think this was a phenomenal, huge failure, but it had this Amazonian mechanism that you guys are talking about of learning from it, taking the best, not repeating the worst, and making something new. So this is the like what a lot of companies don't do.
And you can also put, I think, to reduce that scope of failure, give the tooling to people, engage a wider selection of stakeholders. Don't just be talking to senior leaders in a business and assume that they're going to have all the answers, because they don't, they don't in the nicest possible way know everything. But putting those guardrails in place also means building, I think critically, a really strong data foundation. we can do all this amazing AI stuff, but if you haven't built it on a solid foundation, I'd love to make a joke about pyramids. You don't build them on sand, but actually they worked all right for a few thousand years. But the reality is, you want to have a successful AI project, you need to start with a successful and a strong data foundation. And for many organizations, they are still, their data is not necessarily in control. Their data is not, they don't know where the data is. It's a mess. The number of organizations that I've spoken to, even just in the last few months, because of this, the zeitgeist of this topic, they're saying, actually, before we do data and AI, we're just going to start by doing data well. There's an interesting a term from a guy called Dave McCrory. I think it was about 15, 16 years ago. He coined this term, data gravity. And that's the concept that data, much like a planet, has gravity. And so the larger the volume of data, the more likely it is that it's going to pull other sources of services, data, applications towards it, much like a planet pulls in moons and so on and so forth. And so what's interesting is the decisions you make today about where you keep your data are actually decisions that then impact where applications and data that you're going to procure in 5, 6, 7 years potentially down the line. You're already making that decision today. You just don't know it. Now that sounds really scary, because that's like, oh, then I can't make the wrong decision. Now I'm going to potentially get into analysis paralysis, like we were talking about before. But actually, using an American phrase, it behooves us to do the reverse. And the reason is, we need to have a strategy today so that we can plan for that future. There's another concept, something called data inertia. Data inertia says that, the larger the volume of this data, the harder it's going to be to move, and the more complicated and complex it's going to be to move. Having drawn in all these other applications and services, then this beast becomes even more unwieldy if you then want to make a decision in the future. So it's really important now to start thinking about, what are my data foundations? Where is my data? And what am I going to do with it to set myself up successfully for the future? Make those decisions now, even if I'm not implementing for another 6, 12, 18 months.
And I mean, one of the things I'd build on that you both sort of said there, and one of the pieces of advice I give to a lot of people is, I love the phrase, measure what matters. And it comes back to the purpose. We've talked about the purpose or the mission, whichever phrase you want to use. When you understand the purpose you're trying to achieve, then you'll understand what success is, and therefore you measure what matters for the success you're looking for. And that can help keep you, grounded and guided and heading towards your North Star. I'm going to put you both on the spot now, because it's fun to do that. We've talked a lot about the risk mitigation, some of the challenges with adopting new technology, and the different mindsets we need. What do you believe is the best example that you've been involved with in using AI technology so far?
So there's so many really interesting case studies that we've been involved in over the past couple of years, or past many years. One of the ones that really stands out to me, we worked with a regional organization, public sector organization in Brazil. And the challenge that they were facing was climate change. Climate change is massively impacting the people who live in that particular region, and they are having more and more instances of really heavy rainfalls, causing people to be literally at physical danger of life, as well as turfed out of their homes, having to escape, so on and so forth. And the biggest challenge they had was everything they were doing was always retroactive. They were reacting to whatever the weather situation was, instead of being proactive. And they recognized this was a massive challenge. And so they got together with SoftwareOne and with Amazon, and we came together as one team to find a solution. And that solution, which is now out and running in the wild now, literally saving lives, was to pull the address data for people living within that region from one source. The second part was to pull weather data from Inmar satellite data. And the third one was to pull data from a highly secure database around vulnerable individuals within the country. So it's a very secure platform. And grabbing all that geolocation data together, we were able to monitor what is happening with weather patterns, identify potentially yellow, amber, red weather events in particular regions, and not only send alerts to individuals to be able to tell them this is a risk and we highly recommend that you leave this area because you've got danger to life, but actually to proactively tell NGOs, state entities that can actually get proactive assistance in that region before the event happens, rather than having to react to it after. And it's a fantastic example of how that's not, again, we talked about generative AI and machine learning. That is a machine learning project. That is not all of the, generative AI wonderfulness. It is literally using a technology that's tried and trusted.
But it comes back to the discussion we had. What was the purpose? It's a very clear, very valuable purpose for the people of that region.
Exactly.
The technology becomes the secondary element. It's about achieving the goal you're looking for.
Everyone can get behind a why of saving lives.
Dimitrij, over to yourself.
No, I think it's, I wouldn't say specifically one, but I think what I've seen over the last 12 months working in a global role is quite the opposite of what the broader Gen AI fear-mongering was, of replacing jobs, replacing people. It's going to do X and Y. Maybe it's peculiar to, or particularly important to the organization we work with, but every project we've done is about empowering people. It's about accessibility. It's about doing more. It's about helping them. It's about things we don't have time for right now. So we launched the case study with WordReader. And this is an NPO which is about helping kids learn to read. And it's just the teachers are helping students learn. They're interacting with them day and day, but it consumed a lot of time of theirs to come up with new, innovative way to interact with these books. So they were essentially, because of they had to do this back office work, not really present maybe on the next day with the children because they had to work late in the night to prepare for the class. So we partnered together with them and we created a solution that would take the book in and would create a suggestion of what could be good activities to play with so that the kids would have a much more interesting time interacting with these books. So now the teacher was saving hours and hours every day, not trying to come up with their own activities, or maybe creating something innovative where, as before, they had to do something they have done 2 years ago, and they were way more focused on the next day working with kids. We work right now on an onboarding process of one of the colleges where there are immigrants coming into this country. You know this. We have multiple wars going on, and they want to integrate, they want to work here, they want to learn English, and the processes are not designed for these people. Tutors right now spend their own free time to help these people fill out a piece of paper where AI can help. So if I go across the world, the most interesting projects are about fixing inefficiencies so that people can be more people, instead of being translations machines or content generation machines, and really focus on being a great customer service representative and comforting the person, or being focused on being a great attentively listening teacher, or focusing on being a tutor, helping somebody be integrated into the day-to-day life rather than filling out PDF forms.
It's interesting. Both the stories are hugely impactful, but they're human stories. We talk about the human beings and the human impact first, and the technology second. And yeah, it's very, very much purpose-led, mission-led first, and then coming back to how do we achieve these great results that you've obviously had.
And there was a comment you made as well around it's not about replacing humans in some of these, and that's, I think, a big fear of people. There's a really interesting session I went to at reInvent last year, presented. It was one of these chalk talks presented by a solution architect from AWS. And he said, large language models do things amazingly right, or get things amazingly right and interestingly wrong, which I just thought was one of my favorite quotes from the whole of last year's reInvent. And the key here is, I think, a lot of the large language models, generative AI, is going to do some really amazing stuff, but you still need to have a human in the loop. And we talk about this concept of human in the loop. I think people get confused about, do we need a human in the loop, or do we need a human in every loop? And the answer is we don't need a human in every loop. We just need to make sure that there is also somebody who's actually reviewing what is being generated by these solutions and constantly iterating and improving them. And a perfect example, an organization that we partner with who works in the retail sector, they have a catalog of 2.8 million items, I think, on their website. It's all very technical information. And their challenge was they would get content from their suppliers, which was super technical, PDFs, etc. And that was effectively their marketing material on each page on their site. Not very human-friendly, not very consumer-friendly. And they wanted to improve that adoption and improve sales rates and so on and so forth. And so we generated a solution for them to automate the import of all of these PDFs, use LLMs to generate the content, to actually generate marketing content on each and every one of these 2.8 million pages. We're not going to have a human going to check 2.8 million outputs, but what you do have is you have a human in that loop who's checking a percentage of them and then feeding back into that model so that you can continue to improve the model, improve the prompt, and ultimately get a better solution at the end of it. So I think functionally there'll be a lot of things where humans and AI are going to be working in tandem as opposed to one replacing the other. And many of these activities are things that a human would never be able to do. You can't, unless you have 2.8 million people, you're never going to do that job.
Yeah, and I don't think we're reinventing the wheel with the human in the loop process. I think this is very like a traditional quality assurance process you might have on a factory production line. If you're producing automobiles, you're not going to necessarily check every single part of every single car because the time involved is very, very expensive, and you've got quality procedures in place to try and make sure you don't need to. Right. But what you'll always do is test a percentage of anything that comes off of a production line, and it's very similar to the human in the loop process you're talking about here.
I think I like to take a different perspective on it, especially with generative AI, because what I've seen since the launch, since this big wave started, let's put it this way, because it arrived immediately in the boardroom, it arrived immediately in the CEO. Because
the airplane magazines.
In the airplane magazines, exactly. It's like, it reminds me actually of, the executive getting iPhones saying, everybody build a new app now because I want this on this phone. And then IT security went bonkers and like, what do we do with all the BlackBerries? And I have no idea how to manage that. But it becomes a net new technology moment, and we have to apply every knowledge we have about adopting new technologies. So you're with me on testing, on quality assurance. But I think the fascinating is it feels so human-like. When you talk to it, it behaves like a human. It is as irrational as a human, depending on the temperature set that you do. I think, and this is what I recommend a lot of leaders to do, is like treat it like a new employee. You have to have a mentor to it. You have to have a coach. You have to onboard it. You have to review its work until you're safe that John Smith AI is performing the work you want it to do in a way, in an error rate where a department of people are doing it similarly. So it's an interesting gap, because on one side we love that it's so human-like. We can talk to it, we can check with it, it can describe us pictures, but then we treat it like a piece of deterministic technology that needs to be confined and framed and treated. And organizations are afraid to loosen up this area of control, like to do like, I trust my department to do this. And we are used to this. I mean, we are used to hiring 50 people, giving them goals and having guardrails, training them on not send confidential information out to the internet. We are trained to monitoring customer service agents, aren't we? But then we still launch generative AI out there without any oversights and any monitoring. So yes, apply all the best practices of launching a new technology stacks, but if they do one more, take some of your HR learnings of onboarding new employees. How do you give freedom? How do you ring fence that freedom? How do you observe, and how do you know when to let go? Because now this specific AI is doing the job really well. So let them go, let them be creative.
I'm going to talk about the next 12 months, and I'm very interested to get the predictions from both of you. It's always challenging staring into the crystal ball and trying to guess what's going to happen next, especially in an area that's moving as fast as data and AI at the moment. But I'm really intrigued to hear what you guys think we're going to be looking out for in the next 12 months.
So I think the first thing, actually, it relates to exactly what Dimitrij was talking about a second ago, is around that guardrail space, because there's a huge amount of capability and amount of flexibility with what you can do with large language models, generative AI. But back to the trust discussion we were having earlier on, how do you increase that trust? How do you improve that trust? And how do you put the guardrails at the beginning and the end of a generative AI process to make sure that what is coming in at the front is going to be requesting things from the AI which are appropriate to what it's meant to be doing. And then the output is actually appropriate to what is expected, and not, you don't end up in a scenario where people are writing haikus about how bad your organization are via your chatbot. So I think we're going to probably see a significant number of startups in that space, which are really around putting guardrails onto generative AI tooling.
And I fully expect, on that point, to see organizations, particularly in regulated industries, maturing their governance framework around the use of generative AI and how they democratize their data, how they make their entire organization have the ability to take advantage of it. And I think as part of that, we'll see a rise in generative AI center of excellence being created across organizations, very similar to we saw cloud center of excellence being created in a lot of different companies, going back a couple of years ago. And there's a very well-known retailer I work with who have already created this in their organization and are seeing the benefits. I mean, next 12 months from your perspective, Dimitrij.
So we just touched on this employee thing, and I think their generative AI agents will become more and more adopted within the organizations, as it allows to chain specific prompts together into an orchestra of tasks. Agent systems have been a utopia forever. I think even my university, which is a couple of days ago, I was already thinking about agentic systems, but now we see way more adoption of the idea of using generative AI with human-entered prompting to fulfill more complex tasks than just doing text transposition. So it's going to be an interesting field. It will be interesting to see about observability. I'm excited to see what AWS will be doing in the space as well because of your broader collaboration. In the field that we work mostly with the organization that come to us, multimodality will become critical. So this is about no longer interacting with text, but way more interacting with language, because it opens much wished for functionality for organizations for accessibility. And as voice becomes more accessible, language becomes more accessible. On the similar side, we will be looking at visuals and video becoming more accessible. I hope that, and I predict, because some of the technology demos there, that at some point I can be talking to generative AI application, multimodal application, like I would be to a human being. Like, just look over here, what does it do? And I think it will open a world of opportunities for people that have very little opportunities today to interact with society, but also help us in general. And the third one, we are, in my opinion, drifting towards a plateau in what LLMs can do with the current GPT design architecture. So I think there will be tons of optimization on the infrastructure side, the rise of smart language models. We see this a lot of happening on Hugging Face right now with specialized, optimized, place parameter models and optimized hardware, which will hopefully make everything I said before, which is way more Gen AI than just LLMs, still become cheaper and cheaper through all the optimizations being done. So more complex, more accessible, and cheaper for the next 12 months.
I think there's an interesting one between what both of you have said. So you were talking about multimodal, so effectively users sharing their data of one form or another. It could be video, it could be voice, it could be photo, whatever, images. And you're talking about regulation. I think that actually leads to combine those two, it leads to what I think is probably the other biggest thing that's going to impact IT over the next couple of years at least, is digital sovereignty. So we've seen, if we just look in Europe alone since 2018, you started with GDPR, but actually since then there's been 5 or 6 other major pieces of regulation, DORA, AI Act, CHIPS Act, etc. And we're seeing other countries around the world following suit with that type of an approach. In fact, to the point where if you look at some of the regulations in some countries, it's almost a photocopy of GDPR, but just with some of the wording changed and the language rewritten. And so I think the impact on the data and AI space is actually going to be driven very largely by regulation coming from not just Europe, but actually other countries around the world. And digital sovereignty and data sovereignty is going to be increasingly more on the boardroom table as a discussion point. And organizations need to start thinking today about how do they prepare themselves. As we talked about data foundations, how do we get the data foundations and the controls and the governance in place today to make sure that our data is secure and meeting the regulations that we're going to have to adhere to, which are almost certainly going to increase over the coming couple of years.
As it always does as technology matures. If I was to add maybe one more to this, I think I anticipate more organizations working backwards from their business problems as we go forward. So starting very much from a what do we want to achieve, work backwards to how do we achieve it, and where does the ROI come from as part of that. So I think that would be one of my big predictions. And I would love to see more organizations adopt a framework that Professor Rebecca Henderson from Harvard Business School talks about, which is this concept of a Venn diagram between doing good and making money. And that crossover in the middle, and we've heard this with some of the human stories you've talked about today, of achieving the enormous potential of generative AI for good of humans or good of your particular organization, but with that ROI, that sound business case behind it to drive ROI and make projects successful. So I think we're going to see a lot more of that as we go forward in the next 12 months. Okay, last thing for me to say then is, thank you very much, Dimitrij. Thank you very much, Alex, for joining us today. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you. And thank you everyone for joining.